Frederich Chiu, and he is a concert pianist, meditator, entrepreneur, and he will give us a wonderful preview of his career as well as his actual session that he works on with meditation. So we're looking forward to having him present for all of you, and feel free to submit questions through the discussion board that we've enabled in the Canvas course. For all of you who have not yet enrolled in our Canvas class, make sure you look for the course called Music Entrepreneurship Departmental, and you can see all the guest speakers that are coming. You can post questions on the discussion threads. So make sure you join that self-enroll course so you're part of all of this and you can get the online content as well. We're very excited to welcome all of you. How many of you it's the first time you visited Departmental in entrepreneurship? Okay, well great. We're happy to have new of you. And thank you again for coming. I look forward to
Okay, good. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's start off with a little meditation, since that's one of the key things that I do. So to start, just so I know what to reference, how many people here are musicians? How many here are performing musicians, like you perform all the time? Okay, good. That's what I need to know. Okay, so to start off, we just want to take stock of our environment, take stock of the setting. So just without moving, without changing anything that you're doing, just take stock of how you're seated. Are you leaning to the left or the right? Are you leaning forward or back? Are you tense in any particular spot? Does the air feel cool or warm to you? Do your clothes fit snugly, or are they loose? Are they tight? What kind of smells do you smell in the air? What taste do you have on your tongue? What kind of colors do you see? Does the room seem bright or dim? What kind of sounds do you hear? And what kind of music is running through your head at this moment? When I say music, it could be anything from a note or a rhythm, a pitch, a sound, to an actual piece that's just playing. And just listen to that and watch that for a second. And how does that music make you feel? Is it pleasant? Does it make you feel good? Does it make you irritated? Is it frustrating? Is it surprising? So in this state now, where you're aware of your surroundings and how your surroundings are influencing you, think of a piece that you're working on currently, and just free associate with that piece for a second. It could be a piece that you're working on, it could be a piece that you've performed a lot, it could be something you heard recently that's reminding you of something. And try to remember the very first time you heard about that piece. That somebody mentioned it, or that you read about it, or perhaps you came across it in a particular program. Just try to go back to the very first time you heard about that piece. And do you have any recollection of how you felt about that piece when you heard about it? Any positive or negative reflections about that encounter? And then move forward in time to the first time that you started working on this piece, the first time that you actually played some of those notes. And if you recall whether you felt it was easier or harder than you thought it would be. And then move forward again in time to the first time that you actually played that piece in front of someone else. Could be a formal setting, could be an informal setting, but just the very first time that you actually played for someone outside of yourself. And just try to recall whether that was a positive experience or a negative experience. And then move forward in time to the very last time that you had some interaction with that piece. And if you have recall of whether it was positive or negative. Good. So now, having done that exercise, let's get out of the meditation by, again, taking stock of your environment. Having done this exercise, do you find yourself leaning left or right, forward or back, sitting differently, feeling differently? What kind of colors do you see in your surroundings? What smells are in the air? What taste do you have on your tongue? Are your clothes feeling comfortable or tight? Does the air feel cool or warm? What sounds do you hear? What kind of music is passing through your head? And how does that music make you feel? Great, so that's a little meditation for musicians. And there are a number of things that I'll point out that are specific to this meditation that correlate to what does anybody here do yoga or any other kind of meditation practice? Yeah, so very often in meditation practices, the focus is on breathing. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because we all tend to breathe. We all kind of know what breathing is about, and we've done it our whole lives. So it's a common denominator. Anybody who meditates can say, okay, I can focus on breathing as a vehicle for thoughts, as a vehicle for looking into oneself. It's a great reflection of one's internal state. As musicians, as trained musicians who probably started when you were in single-digit age brackets, you've lived with music long enough in your life that music can also be a vehicle for us to meditate. And the great thing about that is, number one, it's a lot more interesting than breathing. Number two, it's a lot more complex and rich. It can more specifically point to things than simply looking at breathing. Everything is reflected in breathing. It's very hard to detect nuance. It's much easier to detect nuance in music. And third, it's very practical, because as you meditate on music, you're actually practicing. You're actually working. So you're getting in a few minutes or a few hours of the practice time that you're so desperately looking for all the time. Music is not something that we use only like part of our brain. We reserve it for music, and then the rest of our brain is used for everything else. It's every part of our brain. We're just adapting it specifically focused on music when we're practicing music. And then we're using that same brain and the same things, the same reflexes to wash dishes. The emotional thing, we don't have an emotional life that's reserved only related to music and then the rest related to interacting with real people. It's all, we have all these resources in us that we use for our day-to-day lives, that we all use all of it for music, and we wish we had more. So everything that we do in music, and they've shown this in a lot of studies, that the brain is the most activated in the most regions when associating with music. So not only do we not have a part reserved for music, we're using every part of our system and wanting more in order to do what we do with music. Which means that anytime we are doing music, we're stimulating things that happen in real life. And vice versa. Anytime we're doing something in real life, we're stimulating some kind of association that's musically related. So when I asked you what music is running through your head, how many of you had a very clear, just like there was a piece running in your head? Okay. And how many of you were kind of like, music, I wasn't quite sure what was there, what was going on? Yeah, okay. I would assume that there is music always in your head, being a future doctor of music. But sometimes we don't recognize that because we're not used to the idea of looking for that. But there's always going to be some kind of musical association, and but it might not be a piece. It might be a rhythm, it might be a pitch, it might be some kind of gesture. But very often, if we start looking at that music, it's going to start giving us a kind of a symbol of what's going on in us. There's the music, there's our reaction to it, how that music makes you feel. Like sometimes you're just listening to it like a radio in the background. Sometimes it's this earworm is just kind of like, like Baby Shark or something like that. It's just like, get out of my head. But for example, when I do one of my workshops and I have 7, 8 people in front of me in a room for 3 days, and they don't know each other, and I'm trying to get them to know each other and to interact with each other and manage a whole thing, invariably I'm thinking of Bach. And there's just a very clear and almost stereotypical example, like multiple voices, trying to get them to interact with each other, talking about the same subject but coming from different perspectives, so I can't help myself now, of course, to think about Bach as soon as I get a group together. But I also know that what it takes inside of me to deal with Bach, to deal with a 3 or 4 voice fugue, and multiple nuances and changing atmosphere, changing settings, changing dialogue, all that kind of stuff. I know that any skills that I have to manage Bach will serve me also in managing 4 real voices in front of me, and vice versa. So I'm trying to put myself into a mind frame that will be the most appropriate for the moment. Meditation is a practice which goes hand in hand with memorization and the mental work that we all do as musicians. But it's a flip to it. It's a very passive activity. It's not the search for material and bringing it in. It's the understanding of where that material has landed. It's understanding where all that stuff that you've collected, how it's organized itself. You've taken it and you've thrown it into a room, and it's all piled in there. It's kind of like looking to see, okay, I'm going to look over here for that thing that I know is there. It's more observing, and it's much more of a, how can I say it? It's passive. So it's very important for us to be able to practice this perspective of passivity, and have confidence that it is work, that it is constructive. Us as musicians, we're very much about doing, we're very much about performing, doing things in time, doing things at the right time. And so the idea of something passive and just sitting and watching is something which is a little bit antithetical to us as musicians. But it's a very important part of what we do. So let me take you through just very quickly some phases of my life that kind of reflect how I got to this, and what are some of the consequences, some of the offshoots of having done this kind of work. And this is me. I realized at a certain point that my life kind of naturally fell into 12-year segments. And being Chinese background, the Chinese zodiac is a 12-year cycle, so that seemed to have a little bit of symbolism. So my first 12 years is about just being a good child, being a good child to my parents, doing what they told me to do, taking music lessons when it was time to take music lessons, doing sports when it was time to do sports, scouts, school, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't about me, and I think I could say, for most of us, we don't really develop our personal identity or really have this kind of personal kind of let's do stuff. We don't have like that kind of perspective on life before until we're 12. So that was my life. Here's me in the second phase. 12 to 24 started off with me in marching band. I played cello and I played French horn in marching band and oboe. I played cello for a number of years, and it was great because I was able to be in orchestra and play Mahler First Symphony and Beethoven Fifth, and just amazing pieces that I know now from the inside, and get that kind of collaborative experience that a lot of pianists don't get a chance to do. And 12 to 24 was really about looking to teachers, expanding my world from my parents to my learning environment and the teachers who were trying to guide me, give me information, give me advice, and doing well by them. It wasn't about establishing my own voice. It wasn't about interpretation or anything like that. It was about study and technique and just gathering information. And then at age, and testing myself. So getting diplomas, going to competitions, doing competitions, trying to win competitions. I would say that was how I would describe the 12 to 24 period. This is where I started performing. This is John Nelson, who was the conductor of the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra at the time. I was 14, I played with them. That was one of my very first kind of concerts that really stood out. Then at age 24, I made a huge break in my life. I had finished my bachelor's at Indiana. I had gotten a bachelor's in music, also a bachelor of science in computer science, because that was something I was very interested in. My father was teaching math and physics and computer science when I was growing up, so I got a lot of exposure to that early on. And I took some classes with an amazing thinker named Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, which won a Pulitzer Prize. I read it 3 times in high school. I was a total geek. And so I took computer science classes with him. I had gone to Juilliard. And then age 24, I was in New York with all the other thousands of Juilliard grads, all trying to do the same thing, all trying to win competitions and get a career jump-started that way. And I made a big decision to just leave that scene behind. I studied competitions and the way competitions were organized, and I just couldn't reconcile myself with competitions. I knew at this point whether I played well or not, but it didn't seem to correspond with whether I was getting good results at competitions. There were times where I played really well and I was kicked out in the first round. There were times where I didn't play well at all and I went to the finals or even won prizes. And so I started looking at it with my kind of math science background, and I thought, you just can't. How can you judge this subjective thing with an objective lens? There are going to be things that fall to the side, and there are going to be certain kinds of characteristics that come up, and those characteristics are not offending, not sticking out. That's what's mathematically going to rise to the top. And so with that kind of understanding at that time, I said, I can't deal with this. And so I went to Paris. I had been invited to go there to give a concert. I went, I fell in love with Paris, as all Americans do. But I had the opportunity to apply for an artist residency there, which I did, and I moved out to Paris. And this was really a critical moment. It wasn't planned at all, what happened next. I ended up in a little closet for about 7 months. I had gone a couple of days before my move-in date to this beautiful one-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of a building overlooking the Seine. I had the Notre Dame Cathedral right over the balcony, and if you walked out of the balcony, you had like a 360-degree view of Paris. I mean, it was just absolutely unbelievable. And I had my own piano in my place, so I could practice at the time I wanted. It was just amazing. So I eagerly went out to Paris, and the teacher who I had made contact with had a little storage room. He said, well, you're here a couple days early, so why don't you just, there's a mattress there, just crash there for a couple of days before you move in. So during those 2 days, the director of this program had a heart attack and went to the hospital and spent many months recovering, and the whole program was kind of put on hold while he was offline. And so all of a sudden it was like, well, sorry, you can't move in quite yet, maybe next week. But, you know, it was all just kind of week by week. And so Marian, my friend, who was loaning the apartment to me, he said, well, you can stay as long as you want. I'm just using it as a storage closet. And it literally was just putting stuff in there. And so we cleared out some room. And there was no kitchen in this place. There was a hot plate. There was a sink. There was no bathroom. There was a toilet on the stair landing for that floor. This was like an old Parisian brownstone. And there was no piano, of course. But it was right at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. An amazing neighborhood. There were baguettes all over the place. There was cheese. There was wine. It was just amazing. And I was learning French, and I wasn't unhappy in that environment. I was very nervous, especially as concerts started coming up, and I realized, you know, I really do have to practice. And at that point, I had always practiced 4 to 5 hours a day, every day, on my own piano, and whenever I wanted. And this was the very first time in my life that I actually wanted to practice and I couldn't. And I started networking. I started meeting people and asking them if they had pianos. If they had a piano at their place, were you going to be out so that I could come over and practice on your piano while you're out? And I created a little network of pianos all around Paris, and I would go, you know, on Tuesday it would be over here, Wednesday over here, and I'd get a couple of hours here and there. And there were many days where I didn't have a piano at all. And of course, I wasn't able to practice the way I usually practiced, and so out of necessity, of course, I started making a to-do list of things that were, you know, just trying to parse what was essential, what was not. How much time would this really take if I really boiled it down to the essence? And while I was on the metro or on the bus going to the place, I would look at my list and make my list. And then coming back from the place, I'd look at my list and say, this worked, this worked, this worked, and this didn't, and I need to add this and that. And eventually I created a whole routine of strategizing and planning that went along, that bookended my actual physical practice sessions. And then I remember a couple of the first concerts that I played during this 7-month period. And I was completely panicked because I had the idea, of course, that I knew that I had not practiced 4 hours a day, every day, leading up to the concert. So in my mind, how could I play well? How could it possibly happen? And so I went to the concert and played, and there were things that crashed. And there were also things that went really well. Physically, I wasn't completely debilitated. I was able to move my fingers. My memory was actually quite good because I was looking at my scores, and I had been studying structure and form and doing that just by doing my to-do list. I was forcing myself to do that kind of study. And really, after 3 or 4 concerts, I realized that there was this complete split between 3 parts of me that I had never really distinguished before, which is body, mind, and heart. I think those are and I started realizing that there were real conflicts between the 3 and real differences in this kind of environment where I was not practicing as much as I wanted, but I was doing a different kind of practicing. My mind was just like completely like top, you know, like memory was like solid. The first time that I really had a sense of structure about pieces, I was learning French and I was just brushing up on that whole cultural kind of thing. So I was just like hyper aware and my knowledge was just like super high. Physically, I was kind of neutral. I realized that I didn't have to practice 4 hours a day. My muscles still worked. I wasn't losing accuracy and strength. And so that was kind of neutral, kind of stable. And then emotionally, I was like way down here, totally lacking confidence, totally stage fright, which I had never had up until then. Although now I realize that denial of stage fright is a symptom of stage fright, so I was denying I had stage fright, and I was very proud of that. Now all of a sudden, all the real like classic stage fright symptoms were coming to me. And so how could I be so at the top of my game mentally and at the bottom of my game emotionally, and then the body was just kind of hovering in the middle? What was going on here, and how could I practice the things that needed practicing? I realized that my job was really starting to split into 3 buckets. One was to maintain the physical body work. Second was to work mentally. And third was to work emotionally. And what did that mean? What did that look like? What did that feel like? How could I recognize what needed work and what that work might look like? My practice routine, which consisted up until then of sitting at the piano and playing through pieces, was something that was actually preventing me from doing some of the mental work and almost all of the emotional work. So a lot of the times when people have problems, they come to me and they're like, I can't play this passage, or I can't figure this thing out, or I'm having stress issues, or I'm having a muscle issue here. The solution is actually to just not practice in the traditional sense. The solution is to redefine practicing, to be able to incorporate mental practicing and the meditation half of mental practicing that we generally don't learn. And then all of this stuff that I call emotional practicing, which is psychoanalysis, it's just awareness of your own internal state, being able to split your emotional reaction to music from your emotional reaction to performing. And those 2 things are very, very different, and they don't correspond at all. The hardest parts in a piece aren't necessarily the most tense emotional parts of that piece. And the most simple parts of a piece are not necessarily the least dramatic parts. So to be able to split my job as a performer from my job as a communicator was very important to be able to do at this point. What do I have here? Oh, this is top secret slide for pianists only. So, and I don't mean pianists are superior to other people. I mean that by being a pianist, one has already trained body, mind, and heart to the utmost. And that's a goal that we're all striving for as pianists, get to do that unconsciously just by being able to play. And these are some of the things that just come from training, and whatever instrument you play, musicians in general are pretty superior beings because we're all involving all of the body, all of the mind, all of the heart in these kinds of things. So you'll relate to all of this. One thing I'll note here in the mind part for pianists, which is a very conscious thing, which is more or less subconscious for most other musicians, is the multitasking. Pianists at the very first lesson, you play a melody here and an accompaniment of doing two things that are coordinated but independent is built into the idea of playing the piano. For most other instruments, you're playing a note, and it's about how to use all the different parts of your body, mind, and everything to play that note perfectly, beautifully, and appropriately. So there's obviously multitasking going on there, but it's not overt. So that would be the one thing to note. And then these are universal for all musicians. Emotional exposure to high art, emotional understanding of others, and there are so many social interactions that musicians go through with colleagues, with authority figures, with students, with individuals, with anonymous large groups, all the different kind of interpersonal interactions are in music. And of course, emotional extremes in oneself related to performing, getting on stage and performing in front of an audience, and doing that as a regular part of your life. Most people never do that. Some people get to do that every once in a while in their whole life. They'll get up and do some presentations. For us, it's part of our job. So I would say, just I guess 90% of the people in the world don't get to do what we do in terms of understanding and experiencing performance anxiety and getting a chance to really see the data in us and figuring it out. The other emotional challenge that I think is not really maybe recognized as an emotional challenge is discipline. The idea of going to a skill and working at it every day for hours and hours, for days and days, for over years, before you expect to see some kind of achievement of some kind of goal. It's something, especially for young people. Any of you who started when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, like, what kid is going to say, oh, I'm going to start doing something now and maybe I'll get to be able to really do it well when I'm 20? No kid is going to do that. So somehow there has to be an emotional training that gives you the motivation to keep your interest, your excitement about an activity going for that long of a period. And that's something also that I would say 90% of the world doesn't experience. They don't get a chance to experience training themselves for something from a single-digit age. So you combine the performance experience and the discipline experience, and musicians then are they're in the 1%. Really the 1% of people who get to experience this and get to know themselves through these two lenses at the same time. And it's very rare. I'll skip this. I'm forgetting that. Okay, so in talking about stage fright, I just want to focus on this because this is something which I think a lot of you will recognize. We talk about performance anxiety. A lot of people ask, how do I get rid of performance anxiety? How do I deal with these symptoms? And unfortunately, the answer is you can't get rid of it. But what you can do is stop what a phenomenon I call snowballing, which is taking these core stage fright reactions and building on them. Understanding yourself enough to know that this little bump, which is always going to happen, it's like when you hit your knee and you kick. You kick something and then it stops. It doesn't just keep kicking like that. What we're trying to do is stop this kicking from just like repeating over and over again and starting something else, like getting me off balance, and then I fall, and then I hurt my elbow, and then all this kind of stuff. So shame humiliation is a psychology term for that little moment of blushing, that little moment of embarrassment, that little moment of like muscles like, oh my God, I can't do this. Which happens whenever you try to do something and you don't succeed. And as performing musicians, we're always trying to do something. And there are going to be many times where we don't succeed in doing that. So we're going to experience what in psychology we call shame humiliation. The problem is that shame humiliation is a series of reflexes. There are physical, mental, and emotional reactions to not being able to do something you want to do. And those will happen. It's the kick. It's whatever those symptoms are, they may, for you personally, in your experience, may be a trigger for some other reactions. In this particular case, surprise, startle. You might be surprised that you had a shame humiliation reaction at a certain moment. If you expected, if I expect my leg is going to kick, then I'm not going to put myself in a place where I'm going to kick something. But if I'm like somewhere and and not only do I kick, but I also create a whole thing, And then creating that might trigger some other things like anger, rage, like, oh God, I didn't want to break that. And then breaking that thing might trigger some other stuff. So let's say in this case, fear, terror. What if more of those things happen? And then just as a final thing, distress, anguish, everything's falling apart, I give up. So you see this big ball of stuff is really a snowball of a number of different reactions. And so this is what happens in emotional practicing is we start to understand what are these packages of reactions? What are these things called affects? And how do they trigger one another in me? How does shame, humiliation trigger surprise, startle in me? The same reaction is not going to trigger the same reaction from you or you. Everybody has their own emotional baggage, their own experience, and their own associations of this means that, this means that, this means that. So, 10 minutes, yeah. So, I think this is one of the things that I figured out from my Paris experience is that I had always started practicing with the physical. I always, when I got a score, when I got a new piece, a new assignment, I would sit down at the piano and I'd start to play it. And I'd work my way through it. And I realized when I was while I was playing it, sight reading it, that, oh, this is going to be hard, I'm going to have to figure this out. Oh, this one is not going to be so hard, da 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 da. And then I start looking at, almost subconsciously, the structure starts becoming apparent to me. And then I start thinking about, oh, what am I going to do with this passage? What's the emotion here? How am I going to interpret this? How am I going to communicate this? So then I start thinking about the expression. And in fact, I needed to turn things around in a different way where instead of body inspiring mind, inspiring heart, and then trying to go back to the body again, I had to go in the other direction. Figuring out first why I wanted to do something. Figuring out first what was my motivation for wanting to play this piece. How do I want to play this particular movement? How do I want to play this particular chord in this context? And then using that desire, the energy that I had to then decide how am I going to achieve that? What are the ways I'm going to work, strategize, multitask in order to make that happen? And then actually go and try and do it. Physically move some keys around, do some stuff, whatever, and create this change in my environment that would reflect the thing that I wanted to do, and then kind of monitor that, like, oh, it worked. I feel even better. I'm going to do more of that. Or no, that's draining my energy. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to change my strategy and do something else. No. So this cycle of heart going to mind, going to body, and cycling around that way was a lot more productive and a lot more meaningful as a musician. Okay, so now I'll just close with these last 12 years, 48 to 60 kind of cycle. Oh, so what was it? 24 to 36 was about performing, interpreting. 36 to 48 was about teaching. So this is where I was implementing these meditation things for myself and realizing there was something that I had not learned in school that I really needed to communicate somehow. I needed to develop it myself and then share it with people. And so I went through a need to teach and doing well by students. And then the last 12 years, 48 to today and forward, really doing well by community. Trying to use music, trying to use the arts, trying to use my understanding of meditation and life, which I found through music, to help people around me, to help create connections. Because in the end, I think arts are about communication. It's about community building. It's not about art for art's sake. I really don't believe art for art's sake is the right message, at least for myself. Art is for community. It's the reason piano playing is so important and has survived 300 years through all the technology changes. People are still playing the piano. It's because the piano provides a philosophical, it fills a philosophical need that humans have. You imagine, so you go to, like a show with dancers, and all the, like you have Beyonce and you have all her troupe of backup dancers behind her, and they're all like doing these crazy moves. Sometimes they're moving completely identically, and yet if you looked at one individually, you'd say, oh, they're just improvising stuff, but they're all moving exactly the same way, so it was all like totally pre-planned. Sometimes they're totally moving independently and not at all together, but then they all end up in the right place and they do their thing. It's like all these individuals are individually doing their thing, but towards a larger goal. So that's a great human kind of thing. Many people coming together to do one thing. Orchestras, corporations, governments, communities, neighborhoods. Playing the piano, for me, I realize, is filling the flip function, which is also extremely important for humans, which is I'm a pianist, but I'm also a father, I'm also a husband, I'm also a teacher, I'm also an organizer of concerts. I can do more than one thing at the same time. The multitasking that pianists do, which I mentioned. Playing a melody and an accompaniment. Playing multiple voices at the same time and controlling them at the same time. This is something that humans need to do. All humans are multitaskers. All humans are thinking of 3 things at least at the same time. There might not be 3 things in your consciousness at the same time, but there are at least 3 things going on in your mind at the same time. From keeping your heart beating, to your breathing, to your walking, to your talking, to your whatever. All these things are happening at the same moment, and piano playing is a kind of artistic reflection of that. And that's the flip side to this all for one, or one for all kind of thing. And so that's why I think, the arts, to the extent that it, performing arts, to the extent that it demonstrates all for one and one for all, is what makes it so unique and so important for society. So as artists, I would suggest to all of you to look at your own career development, at your own musician, performer development, and see where are these elements of all for one and one for all, and see where you can enhance your impact. Because everybody is going to eventually come to the arts with a sense of openness and discovery. That's why people come to concerts. That's why people don't just sit in their room and listen to streaming and watch videos. They want to go out. They want to be with people. There's going to be personal human interaction, and it's always going to be related around the arts eventually. So I would implore all of you to look at that aspect of your career and your development as you develop things. And remember that you can be more than one thing at any moment. I've developed so this picture is a copper beech tree, 300-year-old copper beech tree on my property, which I moved into a few years ago to develop a kind of arts nonprofit, art, multi-arts activities, salons, workshops, things like that. I never thought I would be running a nonprofit. As a musician, I've never had a regular job in my life before. So I always just pictured myself sitting at the piano and playing, and I'm doing a lot more than that in order to be able to play the piano for more people. I'm doing a lot more than that. So, yeah.
Thank you.